We'll be talking about Gatsby and how that can integrate in with Drupal. So, first, before we get started, who's used Gatsby, or at least tested it out a little bit? Anyone? Just a few? Okay. So, that kind of helped me gauge what I should focus on in the talk. So we'll look at a little bit of code today. Are most of you front-end designers? Front-end designer, developer? Okay. And then some of you more back-end or maybe project managers? Okay, I see some hands. Okay, so you'll see a little bit of JavaScript code today. We'll talk about how to get Gatsby to integrate in with Drupal, and we'll kind of start from the beginning, and hopefully there'll be some time at the end for questions. So some background on me. My name is Shane Thomas. I like to think of myself as more of an entrepreneurial web developer. I've been in the Drupal world for a long time, and I like to keep up with what's going on, as we all need to do in this industry. And that's what's really brought me into Gatsby in the first place. It's something that I was really interested in learning more about. So I'm a developer at Third Grove. And at Third Grove, we build digital experiences with Drupal, Gatsby, Shopify, all kinds of things. And we've worked with a lot of really large, small, medium-sized organizations. And I'm also the founder, creator of Code Karate. Maybe some of you have seen some of my YouTube videos on codekarate.com or on YouTube. And so I do that as well. Not as much as I used to, but I still do it from time to time. So Gatsby. But we're not talking about the movie. So if you're hoping to see a movie, you're not going to get that today. But we will be talking about this Gatsby. Gatsby.js. So what is it? Well, from the website, you can see Gatsby is a free and open source framework based on React that helps developers build blazing fast websites and apps. Okay, I'm sold. That sounds good. Let's keep learning more. But what's React? So you're going to hear a lot of these different terms. Who's used React before? Okay, so a few more. So some of you are very familiar with that. It's a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And then, of course, we know what Drupal is. Most of us, if we're here, it's a CMS that is really flexible, allows you to do some really cool things and build really cool experiences. Part of getting this entire thing to work between Gatsby and React and Drupal is something called GraphQL. A lot of you have probably heard of SQL for querying databases. GraphQL is a query language for querying APIs. So Drupal is your API, Gatsby is your site, and GraphQL is kind of like the glue that holds it together. So it's a query language for your API. So what does all this stuff really mean? There's a lot of terms here. Some of them you might be familiar with, some of them you might not be. So let's break it down. This is a drawing that I wish I could claim credit for, but I can't. We're going to problem solve here, and we're going to break down these larger, kind of more complex topics into smaller pieces. And you'll notice I'm not the company's designer. I designed these slides myself. So you get some... It's funny that I'm speaking at a design conference, but we'll do some fun things anyways. So Gatsby is a static site generator at its core. So that's kind of how it started, but it's so much more than that because it's built on top of React. So anything you can do with React, you can do with Gatsby. So if you used Create React App to build a React app, Gatsby in some ways is kind of like a replacement for that, but it adds a whole bunch of additional features. So anything you can do with React, you can pretty much do with Gatsby. It's just kind of like a different development environment and gives you the static site generation by default. So Gatsby is definitely not static. Even though that's what it's mainly known for, it's not just for static content. So who here has used Notepad? You don't need to worry about this code, but who here has used Notepad to build a website maybe a long time ago? Right? Almost all of us started that way. And if you're like me, your first site's probably turned out something like this. Now, if you somewhere in the 90s were building an Istanbul travel site and I took your image, I'm sorry, but that's pretty cool. I didn't have any screenshots of what my websites look like, but it probably was something like that, right? You're just learning, you're just figuring it out, you're just coding in Notepad. So we're kind of going back, a blast from the past in a lot of ways, because that was static HTML, right? You built it in just a text editor, and it was just your HTML, and maybe threw some CSS in there, and maybe if you're really fancy, you threw a little JavaScript. But that was how we all started. And so that was static. So in a static page, it's just the straight HTML is served. And if you're building a dynamic site like Drupal, there's something on the server running that processes that request and does a whole bunch of things to give you the HTML you actually want. Now, originally we started with static, we moved to dynamic, but now there's kind of a shift saying, maybe static isn't as bad as what we thought. There's some benefits to being static. So we're going to talk about Drupal is a CMS. That's kind of the dynamic side of this. But it's also a really powerful data modeling tool. Right? You can build content types, structures, entity types. You can build relationships. And because of Drupal's nature, it's very easy for it to be decoupled. GraphQL is the glue that holds it together. We've already talked about that. So before we get started, I'm going to show some live demos here in a little bit. We're going to look at some code. We're going to do a bunch of things. I'm not a Gatsby expert. I'm learning this stuff just like a lot of you probably are as well. So just a little caveat. I'm also not a comedian, but I'm going to try hard at both today. So less at the comedy, more at the Gatsby, but a little bit of both. So Gatsby's really great at pulling in data from different sources and building a website. Drupal is really great at exposing its data through an API. So when you put those two things together, it makes a really good combination. And that's why Gatsby and Drupal is very powerful. And you can do build a lot of really great websites with it, really fast websites. So we are at a Drupal conference, but Gatsby also works great with other content sources. It doesn't have to just be Drupal. It can be WordPress, can be Netlify CMS, Contentful CMS. Any headless CMS would probably work well with Gatsby. You can source straight from a database. You could pull straight from a MySQL or Postgres or Oracle or really anything. You can pull straight from Markdown files on your file system. So this slide is these slides here are actually a Gatsby website. So it's Gatsby, it's running, everything's Gatsby. And it's just Markdown files that load in and pull in the slides. And again, sorry, I'm not a designer. So we have a creative director at Third and Grove, and he sent me over this really fancy slide deck, but I already had these slides, and I was looking at trying to convert them into the really nicely designed fancy slide deck, and I unfortunately told him I'm not going to have time for that. So maybe next time you'll get the fancy slides that are a little bit nicer looking than what I have put together. So why do I need Gatsby? Isn't my current CMS enough on its own? We like just building Drupal sites and using Twig to template the files. Why do we need Gatsby? What's the point of it? So you might not need it. Maybe you don't. Drupal's fine on its own. It works really well, right? It's been built. It's been battle tested. It scales. But there's a bit of a difference in philosophy between Gatsby and Drupal that might show you why you might want to start looking at Gatsby maybe for more of the front end of your website. So Gatsby is built from the ground up to be fast. So the quote that I've heard Kyle Matthews, who's the founder of Gatsby, say is, you have to work really hard to build a slow Gatsby site. You have to really be trying. Now, Drupal and other CMSs, if that's a word, I'm not sure, but they're built with a lot of features, right? You can do a lot with them out of the box. You can put plugins and modules and all this stuff to add to them. But at the end of the day, that makes you have to work really hard to build them and make them fast, right? You have multiple layers of caching at all different levels in order to essentially build a static site. You're trying to make Drupal act like a static site by adding all these layers of caching, where Gatsby by default is caching. So we'll talk a little bit about styling and how you can do CSS in Gatsby as well, because this is a design conference. So styling in Gatsby is flexible. You have global CSS files, just as what we're used to. You can use Sass, you can use Less, you can use any preprocessor you want. You build a global file that's across all your pages, and that works. That's great. You can do that. There's also modular style sheets built in Gatsby, and these allow you to essentially make it more modular, so only certain pages load the CSS they need, and it's scoped specifically. So there's some things that we'll talk about on that. And then you can also use CSS in JavaScript. So this is gonna, if you're a designer, it's gonna drive some of you mad at first, because if you're like me, you were told inline styles are bad. Let's not use inline styles. And when you're building sites with Gatsby, and if you're choosing some of these other approaches, it's gonna feel very similar to writing inline styles, which seems really bad at first and seems kind of, I don't know, just seemed kind of dirty to me, because we've always been told like separation is better. But it also allows you to be very specific, so you can style a component to look the same no matter where it's placed on the site. So there's some benefits to that. You get some other performance benefits as well. And you can use JavaScript within your CSS, which is helpful as well. But enough of me talking. Let's do what we actually want to be here. Let's live dangerously. Let's try the whole live demo thing that they say you shouldn't do, but we're going to do anyways. So we're going to look at a local Drupal site. We're going to create a post on that Drupal site. We'll spin up the Gatsby site. We'll see how it pulls it in. And then we're going to look through some of the Gatsby and React code and talk about how it's actually doing, how it's actually pulling the data from Drupal and showing it on Gatsby. So some things we're going to learn. We'll learn how to configure Drupal to work with Gatsby, how you get that set up, how to configure Gatsby to pull in the content, and we'll get a high-level overview of GraphQL. We won't be able to dive too much into it, we just won't have time, but you'll get to at least see the syntax. And it looks a little confusing and daunting at first, but it's actually pretty intuitive. And this, I did design this myself, so it's very, very high-quality work. I'm not taking any clients for my design work at this time, but let's do this. All right, so we have a Drupal website. It doesn't have a theme on it. It's very basic. It is just a simple site with a bunch of posts. In order to enable this Drupal website to work with Gatsby, you have to do one thing. You come in here, you search for JSON API, and you check that one box. That's it. It's going to work with Gatsby now. And now that with 8.7, JSON API is in core, so you don't even have to download a module. It's just there. If you want, you can add extra JSON API extras. There's some additional modules, but those aren't required. You really only need that JSON API checkbox turned on, and it is all going to work. Let's take a look at the structure of the website, of the data at least. This is very basic. I have an article content type. And on this article content type, I have a few fields, some that we'll look at. We have a body field here. We have an episode field. Down here there's a video field, which is a media or entity reference field. And so we'll look at how you can pull in different types of media in the Gatsby site. But this looks all familiar to you, right? This is just a content type. Nothing fancy. Now, let's actually spin up the Gatsby site and take a look at how that's pulled in. So I'm just going to run Gatsby develop and hope the internet hasn't crashed on me. It's going to take a few seconds here. And while we do that, while it's spinning, so what this is doing right now is it's using the GraphQL queries that we're going to look at in a little bit. It's going out to JSON API and it's pulling in that data. So I think I have probably 250, 300 posts that it's going through. And you can see it took, 30 seconds maybe to build that? I do not want to click on Slack. There we go. Hopefully I don't get any notifications. There we go. All right, so now we have this site. Again, there's not much of a theme on here yet, but it's just pulling in the content. So this is the content that was pulled from here. You can see there's a list of the content, and if you look here, there's the content as well. So it's all working, it's pulling in the content as you'd expect. Let's go ahead and make a change to it. Actually, we'll go ahead and we'll add a brand new post. So this is just your normal Drupal interface. Test posts for design for Drupal. I'm not going to put anything too much in here. And we'll upload a video or select a video here. Alright. So we added a video. This is just very, very simple. We save it. Now I go back to the Gatsby site, and it's not there, right? Of course it's not, because it has to be pulled in and rebuilt. So all we need to do is rerun this Gatsby develop. It's going to pull in this new content, and fingers crossed, once it's there, then I should be able to see that post. There are some things that I'm going to show you, because this is kind of a clunky workflow, right? You don't want to have to rebuild the site. We'll show you, there's some live preview capabilities that are coming that the team at Third and Grove has been working on, and of course I failed the live demo. I need to put an alias, just the way that I wrote my GraphQL queries. It needs to have a path. Alright, so we'll save it. We'll try again. And fingers crossed, we'll get our really awesome post to show up on our Gatsby site. But this is one of the features that really needs improvement on the Gatsby side is the actual content editing workflow. It's a really great developer experience in my opinion, but the content editing workflow is kind of the next generation and things that it's definitely what the Gatsby team is working on though as well. They know that this is something that has to be improved, not just for Drupal, but for other content sources. Alright, so there we go.
Guess what? I got a fever. And the only prescription is more cowbell.
So we got our post, it's working, everything's good. Our Gatsby site is now fresh content. So you can see it's working on the back end. Now let's actually look at the code so we can see how it's doing what it's doing. So I have the Gatsby site pulled up, and there's not really too much that I've done here outside of just, probably 50 lines of code to get this to work the way it is. And we'll go through what some of that is. But the first thing, so over here is my kind of file system from the Gatsby site. The Gatsby config file is the first kind of important file you're going to need to change. In order to get Gatsby to play with Drupal, you need to add this here. You're basically saying you want to use the Gatsby Source Drupal plugin, which allows Drupal to connect with Gatsby, or Gatsby to connect with Drupal. You need a base URL. You don't need two. One of them's just commented out in case the internet failed us today, but it didn't, luckily, thanks MIT. So you just need the base URL of your site. And then you need the API base, which by default is JSON API. You can change that in your JSON settings if you want it to be at just API or whatever you want it to be. So by default, it's just JSON API. Those are the only things you need to do to get that connection to work. The next important thing is this Gatsby node.js file. So Gatsby node, it's not exactly the same as a Drupal node, right? Gatsby organizes all of its pages into nodes, is what they call them as well. That's how they reference them internally. So it's not necessarily equal, but it's a very similar concept, right? This is run when you first build your Gatsby site. This is what's going to suck in all that data. And from here, if you have dynamic pages that need to be built out, like all of our articles or blog posts or any of that content, it has to happen here. So this is GraphQL. It's kind of brackety-like syntax that allows you to tell JSON API exactly what data you want. And built into Gatsby, there's actually it's called graphical. It allows you to query the data to see what you're going to get. So let's go ahead and look at that. Alright, so this is essentially allows you to query the Drupal database that we were just looking at. And if I run it, this is going to show all of this content. So let's go through this. All node article. So if I wanted to be blog post, I would change it to all node blog or whatever the content type is. You want all the nodes, and these are the fields I want. I want Drupal ID, which is not the node ID. It's the unique UUID or unique Drupal ID. The title of the blog or the post, and then the path alias. So you can see it's not in any particular order. You can filter it just like you can in SQL. You can order it. You can apply sorting, all that stuff. But it's giving me all of the data here. And there's also autocomplete. So if I wanted to see what's available, I can see what's available. So if I wanted to see, I wanted the episode number, let's say, I could do that. I wanted say the created date. And if I run that, now that data is going to be available. So you can see some of these don't have episode numbers, but they do have a created date. And essentially you can just pull the fields from your Drupal site, and you can then use that in your Gatsby site. So here we're just getting the Drupal ID, because when we're first building, you're going to see why we only need the Drupal ID is the only important thing right now, and the path alias. But we'll kind of go through that. So what this is doing is it's taking the result of this, and it's just going to loop through all of those pages, right? All of those nodes. So for each of these, we're going to loop through. It does a few things here to use the path alias that Drupal has. So if I told it to be that path, I want it to be D4D test was the path I used on that post I created, it's going to use that path alias or fall back to node Drupal ID. And it's going to call in Gatsby create page. And this is what allows you to create so many dynamic pages on the Gatsby side. It's going to pass in the path alias. It needs to tell it what component to use. If you're familiar with Drupal, this is kind of like what template file you want it to use. So if you're used to a Twig template, well, it's kind of like that, but it's just a JavaScript file. So we're going to look at article.js here in just a second. And then it needs to pass in a variable, which is going to pass in the Drupal ID, or that unique ID. And that's really all there is to that. So it's only going out, getting just the article content type. It's not worried about any other pages right now. You could expand this and pull as many different content types, do whatever you want here, and it would allow you to create that. So let's look at some of these JS files. The article one's the one we're most concerned with, but let's look at some of the other ones just to see what it looks like. You can see on the Gatsby site here, I have a header, let's say this context, there's a footer here, there's not much to it, but let's just look at how Gatsby builds those sections, and then we'll look at the actual template file for that article post. So, let's look at layout. So the layout is kind of like the wrapper. And if you use React, you'll be familiar with JSX, which is just kind of like a fancy way to create your own HTML tags in a way and pass data between them. So on this page, we have a header, which is going to refer to this import statement here, which is this file over here. And we have a footer. And then this children is just the content of the page. It's just like a variable. It just spits out whatever would normally be on the page. So if we look at the footer, it's going to be very simple. There's not much to it. You can see I'm using inline styles right here. But again, you could style it however you wanted. If you want to use global styles, you can set it up that way. If you want to use CSS and JS, there's some libraries you can use as well. We have our header, which is just header with a menu, The logo shows up here, or I guess just the link to the website name. So there's really not much to that. This is about as simple as you can get for a markup. But this article template, this article.js file is the important one here. And this is what's going to allow you to build the article page. So if I go back, I click on this, maybe. There we go. So it spits out the title, spits out the tags, it spits out the video. Here's if there was an episode number, it would spit it out there, and then the body. So just it's taking some of the data from the Drupal site and it's putting it in this page. So let's look at how it's doing that. So here's our article. And some of this syntax is going to, if you're not familiar with React, it's going to look a little strange. But if you're familiar with React, it should be somewhat familiar. So if it looks scary, don't worry. It looked scary to me at first too. Spend some time learning a little bit more about React, and it'll start to kind of make sense what it's doing. But here we just have an H1 with the title, and so it's just props.title. Props that's how React can pass data between components. It uses something called props, and it's going to create a list of all the tag names. So you can see it maps the tags to just printing out. That's why there's an unordered list of tag names. It does the YouTube video here, which it uses this YouTube component. When you're building Gatsby and React sites, you want to componentize as much as possible, right? Everything's a component, and that way you kind of have very minuscule parts that kind of piece together your actual page. So the display of this YouTube video is in its own component. Just simplifies it a little bit. And it prints out the body. So there's really not much to that other than the fact that it's loading this template into this article. So that's pretty simple. And then for this YouTube component, all it does is it just styles an iframe and puts the video source in there. So there's not too much to it. Let's look at that. So if we look at the index page, which is the main page of the site, we'll look at that because that is not necessarily a dynamic query that's creating a whole bunch of pages. I have one index page, but I want it to show a bunch of data, right? A bunch of different listings. So we have a different GraphQL query for that. So you can see the GraphQL query here is a little bit more complicated. We have a sort field. We are getting the video field, the source for the video field here. We're formatting the created date in a certain way. And if we plug this into here, we're going to see some results, I hope. If I close up my tags correctly. There we go. So it's getting all the node articles, it's sorting by the created date, descending, and it's only showing the first 25. So it's going to return the Drupal ID, the title. You can see the one interesting thing, and this is something that's tricky about querying data between Gatsby and Drupal, is that normally it's just the field name, but in this case, if it's a relationship field, entity reference fields, which you're using Drupal, you're going to have a lot of entity relationships, especially if you use something like paragraphs or ECK components with inline entity form. You'll have a lot of the field collections, you'll have these relationships, and they all show up in this relationships section of your GraphQL. So it's a little bit confusing on how you get that data, but that's why you can play around in this graphical interface, and you can just find out what the data looks like, and then you can pull it out, and you can put it into your templates. So there's a little bit more to it than that, but that's kind of the high-level overview of how this site's getting built. Let's go back to the slides, and so we'll do some recap. We built the content type, we looked at the fields, we exposed the data just by turning on that JSON API checkbox. It was very simple. On the Gatsby side, we can start a new project that's just Gatsby new my project. We need to add the Gatsby Source Drupal plugin, which I didn't show you how to add that because I already had it, but it's just npm install Gatsby Source Drupal. And then we walk through the code, so I'm not going to show it here, it's kind of small, but the slides are available on that URL in the top corner. So if you want to see them, and you can actually look through that code, and you'll be able to see it a little bit better. GraphQL allows you to pull in the data. We looked through that. Again, there's some tricky formats there. Okay, Gatsby creates all the pages in Gatsby Node. Gatsby Node is the entry point. That's what sucks in the data and creates those dynamic pages. So if you create a page in Drupal and want it to show up in Gatsby, it's got to get processed through Gatsby Node. If you want to just create a page in Gatsby that loads something else, you just create a JavaScript file, and then you can load in other things. So just to show you one example of that, this contact.js file here, it's not loading anything in from Drupal, so all I need to do is go to /contact, take the JS off, and I can load that contact page. So just /contact. So it doesn't not everything has to be sourced from Drupal. You can source different pieces. And then we walked through how Gatsby Source Node pulls in the data, and then it maps to that article template. So at the end of it, though, it's all React components as well. So anything you can do with React, you can do with Gatsby. So this looked like a very static site, but the cool thing about it is once the static asset is delivered to your browser, React is refreshed on the DOM. So anything you wanted to build in React, you could build with Gatsby. It just starts static, and then it can go dynamic from there. So if you're building an e-commerce site, for instance, you might have your product information served statically, but maybe the prices change or fluctuate because you have a lot of sales. That could be loaded dynamically with React. So React would pull in the price information. So you could have some parts of your site be very static, some parts be very dynamic. There are some gotchas here. So I was going to add a funny image. I couldn't find one that I thought was appropriate, but I wanted to remind myself to say something funny here, so I left it in. But I don't have anything funny to say, so we'll move on. So images or videos or paragraphs, anything with entity references are tricky because you need to find the GraphQL data through this relationships field. So it's just mapped not very intuitively. That was something that I struggled with, trying to pull in different images and videos when trying to suck in that data from Drupal and display it in Gatsby. So just know that there's this relationships construct in GraphQL that you'll have to use if you want to pull in video, images, paragraphs, anything with entity references or entity relationships. If you're using Drupal, you're likely going to have that, so you'll have to use that a lot. And so some of those GraphQL queries can get really ugly. Inline images have to be processed a little differently. So if you have a WYSIWYG field that has a lot of images that people can drop in, there's some extra filtering steps you have to do. It's a little tricky to get that to work. It's possible, but there's some extra steps you have to do. Embedded videos don't necessarily work right out of the box. I had to do a little filtering to get the video embed fields from Drupal to work. It was like 1 or 2 lines of JavaScript, but it didn't just work out of the box. And then, as I mentioned, paragraphs or entity references is the same kind of thing as images and media. It's just a little tricky. You have to, especially when you have, if you're familiar with, who's used paragraphs before or something similar to paragraphs? A lot of you, okay. So you know that you might have multiple different components that can make up a page, and you can use that with Gatsby. But there's some additional JavaScript you're going to have to write to pull in that data dynamically. In hosting a Gatsby site, it's different, right? Because we don't have that dynamic generation of HTML content, it's just static. So deploying a Gatsby site, I would just go to the command line, type Gatsby build, and then upload to a static files hosting provider. There's a lot, and that's a lot of them. There's a lot of them out there. Netlify is a good one, but it's pretty simple. There's not much to it. Gatsby build, push it up, and you have it. So hosting is a lot cheaper. It's also a lot more secure, right? Because you don't have a database that's publicly accessible that someone could compromise. So the amount you have to do to try to lock it down or secure it is significantly less because it's just there's not as much risk there. But it's also, the whole process is more complicated in some ways too. So you might, especially if you want other people to be working on the site, the Drupal side of the site, which you most likely do. You have content editors, right? So you have to have a Drupal site somewhere that maybe isn't publicly accessible, but your content editors can access, and then you have your Gatsby site, and they're disconnected. So there are some solutions. Pantheon's what I'm using in this demo to just have my Drupal site live. The cool thing is you don't actually have to push it live. You can just use the development tools for free. Netlify, GitHub Pages, CloudFront, any of those static hosting providers work. And I'll also say there's a Drupal build hooks module that allows you to, when I save content on my Drupal site, automatically deploy and rebuild my Gatsby site. So you don't have to manually do that build process. That helps that's a little bit better for the content editing experience. Still not perfect because you can't actually preview what's going to be pushed live until it goes live, but it works. There are some gotchas here. It's not good for all sites because if you don't necessarily want it to automatically deploy and rebuild your Gatsby site, if you have editors changing things every couple minutes because the Gatsby build will never finish. So there are some things we can do around that, but you need to find a process that works for you. We talked about how React can be used to make it more dynamic, so I'm actually going to skip some of this. But the content editing experience is not quite ideal, right? The biggest disconnect is you edit something on the Drupal site, you have to rebuild your entire Gatsby site in order to see it. So we're going to do another demo. So Third and Grove has been working with the Gatsby team to integrate live preview, where you can change your Drupal content and then immediately see it on the Gatsby site. So we'll show you how that works. So I have a Drupal demo site here. This is just the Umami, if you're familiar with the basic Drupal demo site. It looks like the standard site you get out of the box. I also have just a Gatsby preview site. It's just loading 10 of the articles, or 10 of the recipes, I think, whatever, maybe it's articles, from the Umami site. And let's pull it to the side here so we can see it actually work. And this is hosted on Gatsby Preview or Gatsby Cloud. So if you go to gatsbyjs.com, it's using this Gatsby Preview service, which is just launched. I think it's still in beta, but it just launched from the Gatsby guys last week, I think. So if we go to our content here, and there's an article here called Preview All the Things. You can see it's listed over here. I'm just going to change the title, add a bunch of exclamation points, and I will save it. And you can see before the Drupal site even is done saving, the Gatsby site's updated. So if you're a content editor, now it's actually usable because you can see it live. But let's actually look at the post itself. So again, not a lot of design on here, but we have some images of some dogs. And these are all in paragraph components. So you can see down here, we have some dog images. And let's just reorder. We want the waffle dog to be up top. So we'll move the waffle dog above the other dog. I can change this text to add some more text here. And I could add more text, I could add an image, anything you can do with paragraphs. Now when I click save, you can see it switched over there on the right. Those images switched. My text down here was changed. Everything on the Gatsby site immediately updated using this live preview. And so now it becomes a little bit more of you have the ability to build those more complex content workflows, right? You can have this preview, and then once it's to the contents to the way the content editors like, they can use the build hooks module to click deploy, and that will actually deploy it to their live site. So they have that staging environment and that live preview environment that they're used to. So if you want to know how you can set this up, it's still very early, still very beta. There's still a lot of things we're building. You can go to the slides, and there's this YouTube video that Grant at Third and Grove and I put together on how you can set this up. Future roadmap is keystroke preview. That's a big thing with some of the other Gatsby CMSs. So when you're typing, it's going to show up right away. You don't have to wait till you click save. I mean, that way, there'll be a little bit of a delay, probably 2 or 3 seconds, but it'll show up. And content work integration with Drupal's content moderation, right? So you can do more complex content workflows. So that's it. We're going to have some time for questions. There's some resources here that you can check out. The GatsbyJS.org site has really good documentation. GatsbyGuides.com is a good one. Benji, who's actually around here, if you know Benji, he has a starter for Lando Gatsby Drupal. If you have used Lando, you basically pull it down, Lando start. It takes a long time to set it up, but it'll spin up the Gatsby and the Drupal site for you. So I'm not using that, but I have tried it out. It does work, and it's a good way to kind of get this to start out of the box and test it out. So conclusion, Gatsby and Drupal can be really powerful. They work really well together. There's still a lot more to do. It's still very early in the development process, but we'll keep improving. If you have questions for me, you can follow me or send me a question on Twitter. You can email me. You can stop by after this and talk. We can chat. And Third and Grove's hiring, so we're always looking for good people. So if you're looking for a new opportunity, talk to us. If you're an agency looking to do, or if you're with a company looking to do some of this stuff and you want some help, come talk to me. We can talk about that as well. And if you're interested in, this is the slide deck I used. It's just like a Gatsby starter. So it just allows me to build the Gatsby slides. So that's it. We have time for questions. Does anyone have questions? Yes?
How do you handle things like comments and contacting email pages with Gatsby, or do you not do that?
So the question was, how do you handle comments or contact pages? So that's a really great question. So there are different things you can build in for the forms, for contact forms, but it is JavaScript. So you could build essentially that build the form in Gatsby in React, and then it posts the data to Drupal. So you could store it on both. So you could build a web form and then display it or send the data, or an entity that gets saved, that the data gets saved. There's some third-party form providers as well that allow you more drop-in replacement if you don't want to use Drupal for those form submissions. Comments are a little trickier, and that's where you have to pretty much use React rather than Gatsby, because comments need to be more dynamic, right? It's probably not something you can statically build. You don't want to statically rebuild the site. So typically, you'd probably have either a third-party commenting system, or you'd have your Gatsby site, and then when the page loads, you'd have a React component that would go out to your Drupal site, load in comments from that page, and you'd have that comment form or that widget that would talk back and forth to Drupal. So you could build it, or there's things like Discuss that does a very similar thing. When you load the page, if you use Discuss commenting system, it doesn't immediately show up. It refreshes or loads with JavaScript after the page is loaded. So you could do it, but it wouldn't be built into React. Or into Gatsby. It'd be more something you'd have to build out with React. Any other questions? Yeah.
Image-wise, when you do the Gatsby develop, is there a process that's copying the images over to a new folder, or do you have to recreate the folder structure, or is it just pointing to the original Drupal site?
So it pulls it in, So if you look at it, it's actually, this one's not, that's a third-party image. Let's find one that actually has an image. But yeah, it's pulling it into the Gatsby. Yeah, what it does is it pulls it in during that build process, and so it's storing that static asset. The really cool thing about Gatsby, this is one of the many cool things, is if you've ever been to a page and you see kind of an image that starts, when you first load the page, it looks a little blurry, and then immediately it refreshes. It does that by default. So it blurs the image, gives you that very low resolution, and as you scroll down the page, then it'll start popping in those images as you get to them. The other thing that's cool about Gatsby is if you have links on your page, it can actually start preloading those links before you click on them. So as you scroll down the page, and it actually is going to preload those links to make it faster. So when you click on it, you don't actually have to go through a whole page load. That data was already getting preloaded in the background. So there's some very really cool image optimizations and link optimization that help speed up to make it feel like you don't have any load, right? That there's no load between pages. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I'm wondering, in Drupal, if you're creating views and blocks and stuff, is there an easy way to pull kind of that data into Gatsby, or do you basically have to recreate that on the Gatsby side?
The question was, if you have views or blocks, is there a way you can pull that in on the Gatsby side? And that's a good question. There are ways you can pull in some of that stuff especially if you use more of like a paragraphs-based approach, you can dynamically allow more landing pages to be built. Views, not really. You pretty much have to rebuild those views. So you instead of building the views on the Drupal side, you're probably building the views on the Gatsby side. Same with blocks. There's kind of like this balance between if it's static or something that that's on all pages, you'd put it in your template. It gets tricky if you have blocks that you want to contextually display on certain pages, though, right? That gets a little bit trickier. It's possible, but again, it's a little bit more on the React side. You have to write some logic behind that, and maybe load some of it in dynamically. Or when the page is built, when the page build process goes in that Gatsby node file, that template would have that block in it. So that if we wanted a sidebar on only articles, I'd have to add markup on the article template. Other questions? Yeah.
What's Gatsby do to the timeline for a project? Is it a slower project timeline if you're doing Gatsby, or is it actually quicker in some ways?
So that's the question is, does it slow down your project or speed it up, or what's the timeline look like? I would say initially it's going to slow it down the first time, because there's the learning curve of having to figure it out. At Third Grove, we're pushing to do a lot more decoupled in Gatsby projects. Our argument is that in the long run for us, it's going to speed it up, because you can have a separation of a backend developer building the data model, a front-end developer, kind of JavaScript developer building the front end of the site. And so you can have both those things going at the same time. But I think initially it's going to slow it down until you get the workflow and the tools to be able to build it more quickly. But I think in the long run, it would get to the point where it would be pretty close to maybe even faster. It would just take a while to get there, I think. A couple projects. Any other? Looks like we're about out of time, but I'll take one more question maybe. Yeah.
Are you familiar with Gatsby themes? And if you can talk a little bit about that?
Gatsby themes. So Gatsby themes, it's a little different than what you consider a Drupal theme. It's not exactly the same, but Gatsby themes is essentially a way that allows you to pre-process or put a bunch of settings or plugins together. It's almost like in Drupal what I would consider like an install profile. So a Gatsby theme is kind of like an install profile in Drupal, or maybe a distribution. So essentially, it's a pre-packaged functionality. So yes, Gatsby themes exist, and they are really good places, or you should try them out if you want to have a good starting point for something. Do you have any other specific question on Gatsby themes, or are you just wondering a little bit about it? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, Gatsby themes are out there. Like I said, they're very similar to what we consider like an install profile or distribution in Drupal, not just a theme. It's not just the front end, which it could include that, but it can include more configuration of actually how the Gatsby site is set up. So it's a little more powerful than just a Drupal theme per se. Any other questions? Otherwise, if you have questions afterwards, feel free to come up. I'll stick around and answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you.